talk Article 5. I know Paul has probably got y'all so up to speed on Article 5 that I don't need to spend a ton of time on it. But let me address some of the foundational principles with it. The federal government is a creation of the states. The original 13 states, when they gathered, created the federal government for a specific purpose. With each state added to the Union, Texas was number 25, with each state added to the Union, each new state becomes a joint heir of that process and that relationship as a sovereign state. The advent of the 17th Amendment that changed how we elect our United States senators functionally changed the customer relationship of the states to the federal government. The House was originally construed as the people's house, where the people would elect their representatives and guard the interest of the people. The Senate was elected by the state legislatures, who would guard what? State sovereignty and state decision-making. With the ratification of the 17th Amendment, we fundamentally changed the relationship of the United States Senate to the states. And now we have two bodies in the Congress that represent the people, but nobody in the Congress representing the interests of the sovereign states. There is nobody protecting the states from the federal government in the Senate. There are individual members, but collectively, the Senate is no longer the place where the states prevent bad stuff that encroaches upon the states. That was a century ago, a little more than a century ago. And so where we have come is to the point where the federal government is so, whether it's directive, I don't want to use the term dictatorial, but the federal government treats the states, counties, and the cities as subcontractors to federal will. And when we get into the privacy bill, I'll be happy to explain how that was an element of that problem. It is clear to me the three areas of the Article 5 call that Texas was the 10th state. Paul, I think we're at 12, and Michigan, was it Michigan Senate or the Michigan House?
Michigan House.
House has just voted for it, and as soon as the Michigan Senate does, there'll be 13 states. It's going to take some time. But the three elements of the call were term limits. And look, I'm not necessarily a fan of term limits, but it is clear to me that the Congress of the United States, either body, is not capable of having a discussion and sending to the states for ratification anything that will constrain their own power. Term limits not only apply to potentially looking at congressional term limits, House or Senate, but term limits of executive branch entities. A great example is the FBI director, given our particular previous problem we just had. But the judiciary as well. We have a serious judicial problem of judicial tyranny in this nation, where the bulk of our policy decisions are not made by the people's representatives. We live not under the consent of the governed, but the consent of the appointed and confirmed. That is a strategically large problem. I won't bore you with it all now. But term limits is a mechanism by which we can control and put some sort of temperament on the judiciary. Economic constraints. Most people think, that's the second element of the call, economic constraints. Most people think of the balanced budget amendment, and that's certainly an element of it. But we phrased it as economic and fiscal constraint because there's other things, like, as an example, how many votes does it take to raise the national debt limit? Simple majority. 218 in the House, 51 in the Senate. For us, for Dwayne and I to vote to step into the Economic Stabilization Fund, what's more commonly referred to as a rainy day fund, it takes 2/3 of both bodies. One of the things that I expect would happen with a convention of states is an amendment would be proposed and ratified by the states that would tell the Congress of the United States, you either got to have 2/3 or 3/4 to raise the national debt ceiling. Right now, it is too easy. It's like you being able to call your credit card company and saying, raise my credit limit. And and there's no reality involved in it. The third element is other restrictions on federal power. One of those elements deals with, one of the things that we think would come out of that element of the call is things associated with regulatory control. One of the things that we did in the mock convention, I guess it was about a year ago right now in Virginia, I went to the mock convention. I was one of 4 folks from Texas that went to the, for lack of a better term, rehearsal mock convention that we did. One of the things that we were very concerned with, the state legislators that were all there, is right now, the bureaucracy in the executive branch can write a rule, and if Congress takes no action, that rule has the spirit and teeth of law in the judiciary, and it's regulation by omission from the Congress rather than regulation by commission. So one of the things we did was say, if a rule is proposed by a cabinet or White House executive agency, it is sent to the Congress, and you've got 180 days in both houses to either certify it or defeat it, and not regulate the states by an act of omission. That gets rid of the excuse of our Congress of saying we don't have the votes. It's things like that. It's not things that expand the federal government's authority. It's a rebalance from the federal government being the primary policymaker on every question that we face as a governed, ordered society, to returning the federal government back to its Article 1, Section 8 responsibilities, and leaving everything else to the states, as the 9th and 10th Amendment says. Because right now, the states are nothing more than subcontractors to federal will. There were a number of things that we did. I know I'm going long here, Dwayne, I'm sorry. A lot of folks were concerned with how we choose our delegates. How do you control them? How do you choose them? And the like. One of the things that when I worked with Representative Phil King on this, Phil was the guy I carried this bill with, is making sure that who's the customer of a convention of states? The customer is state sovereignty. There were folks that wanted congressmen or former federal officials, or the governor appoints 6 people. That was unsatisfactory. Look, as much as I think of former Senator Phil Graham, our former senator of Texas, solid guy, I want somebody that's going to walk to that convention as a delegate and know that his mission is the affirmation of state sovereignty, not how do we make this easier for the federal government. And as much as I love Senator Graham, I did not want him to have a bias, having worked in the federal government, to write an amendment in a way that would favor the application of the federal government. I want folks that are serving in the current state legislature when this thing occurs. That way, the individual members, if I got sent to a convention of states, I'm not only accountable to the 840,000 constituents of Senate District 22, I'm accountable to 30 other state senators that could punish me if I do something wrong. If you take somebody that's not a current legislator and send them, you have no check on them, whether at the ballot box or with their colleagues in that legislative body. So that's how we chose those. The Senate will choose its delegates, the House chooses its delegates, and then generally we assume that because the House led with it last go round in 15, the House had the chairmanship of the delegation when we went to Virginia. We broke it up. If there's 5 delegates, the House gets 3, the Senate gets 2. If it's even, if the Congress tells us it's 6 delegates, it's 3 and 3. And then the respective delegates choose a chairman we expect out of the House. But that's how we came up with the mechanism to control them, because that way the institutional pressure as an elected official by you and the institutional pressure as an elected official from my fellow elected officials makes sure that those delegates are under control. The bottom line is this. Just like when you were a parent and you told your kids, if you don't get your house in order, I'm going to do it for you. The states have to say that to the federal government, because right now the federal government's house is not in order, and it's got to be put that way. And the only constitutional authority the states have to do that is through a convention of states. And that's exactly why we're moving in that direction, to put the states back in the position they belonged at the ratification of the Constitution, and that is to be equal full partners with the federal government for their delineated responsibilities, not to be treated as subcontractors, subject to federal will.
Thank you for that. I was proud to be a joint author last session, or in the 84th session on that bill, on that series of bills, and was a joint author this session as well. And I don't think I worked harder on a bill in the 84th legislative session, actually working the floor, than I did on the Convention of the States legislation. And I really believe that the governor coming out and talking about it and putting to rest a lot of the fears and the rumors and what could happen and the doomsday stuff or whatever, but I really think him coming out and explaining it and being supportive of it made a huge difference this session, and I'm glad we got it done. It was an honor to be there with you and the governor to sign that, and yeah, we sure were. So anyways, great job and great work on that. I'm going to talk to you about Sanctuary City.